April 14, 1865, 10:15 p.m., Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. The comedy Our American Cousin reaches its climactic moment as actor Harry Hawk delivers his final lines. In Box 7, President Abraham Lincoln leans forward in his rocking chair, momentarily distracted from the stage by the gentle touch of his wife Mary's hand. Behind him, John Wilkes Booth raises a single-shot derringer, and in 3 seconds, a bullet will tear through the skull of the man who preserved the Union. But as Lincoln's life ebbs away in the Peterson house across the street, a genealogical legacy spanning over 2 centuries dies with him, a bloodline that connects the log cabins of Kentucky to the palaces of English nobility, the persecution of religious dissidents to the liberation of 4 million souls. Abraham Lincoln's story begins not with his birth in 1809, but with a chain of ancestry that stretches back through the mists of early American settlement, each generation carrying within their blood the contradictions that would ultimately manifest in the man who would become both the great emancipator and the great divider. The Lincoln name itself carries the weight of English heritage, derived from the ancient city of Lincoln in Lincolnshire, where Roman legions once marched and medieval cathedrals rose to pierce the sky. Yet the path from the English countryside to the American frontier was marked by religious upheaval, economic hardship, and the constant search for freedom that would define the family for generations. The earliest traceable Lincoln ancestor, Samuel Lincoln, arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637, part of the Great Puritan Migration that brought thousands of English dissenters to the New World. Samuel carried with him more than just his possessions. He bore the genetic legacy of English yeomanry, hard-working farmers and artisans who had survived the brutal social upheavals of Tudor and Stuart England. His blood carried the DNA of survivors, men and women who had weathered the dissolution of monasteries, the persecution of Catholics and Protestants alike, and the constant threat of starvation that plagued England's lower classes. Samuel's marriage to Martha Lyford connected the Lincoln line to another family of religious refugees, creating a bloodline that would carry both the fierce independence of English Puritanism and the adaptability necessary for survival in an untamed continent. Samuel's son Mordecai, Lincoln inherited his father's restless spirit, moving from Massachusetts to New Jersey and then to Pennsylvania, each migration carrying the family further from the Atlantic coast and deeper into the American interior. Mordecai's blood coursed with the iron determination of his Puritan ancestors, but it was tempered by something new: the developing American character that prized mobility over stability, opportunity over tradition. His marriage to Hannah Salter brought Welsh blood into the Lincoln lineage, the DNA of Celtic mountain people who had resisted Roman conquest, Viking raids, and Norman domination. The Welsh contribution to the Lincoln bloodline cannot be understated. It carried within it the genetic memory of resistance to authority, the stubborn refusal to submit that would echo through generations until it reached its ultimate expression in a president who would refuse to let the Union die. But it was Mordecai's son, Abraham Lincoln, the president's grandfather and namesake, who would introduce the most crucial element into the bloodline: the experience of violence and loss that would haunt the family for generations. In 1786, while clearing land in Jefferson County, Kentucky, the elder Abraham was killed by a Shawnee warrior, shot down in sight of his 3 young sons. His death created a trauma that rippled through the genetic and psychological inheritance of the Lincoln family. His eldest son, Mordecai, witnessed the murder and would spend his life carrying the burden of survival guilt and racial hatred. His youngest son, Thomas, the future president's father, learned that America was a place where death could strike without warning, where security was always temporary, and where the line between civilization and wilderness was measured in bloodshed. Thomas Lincoln inherited more than just the trauma of his father's death. He carried within his veins the accumulated genetic heritage of English Puritans, Welsh resistors, and American frontiersmen. His marriage to Nancy Hanks brought an entirely different bloodline into the mix, one that carried its own secrets and contradictions. Nancy's ancestry traced back to Joseph Hanks, who had arrived in Virginia in the 1680s. Still, the Hanks family tree was complicated by illegitimacy, uncertain parentage, and the social chaos of frontier life. Some genealogists have traced Nancy's lineage to Virginia's planter elite, suggesting that her blood carried the DNA of English aristocracy mixed with the harsh realities of colonial survival. Others point to connections with religious dissenters and indentured servants, people who had been cast out of English society and forced to rebuild their lives in the American wilderness. The mystery surrounding Nancy Hanks Lincoln's true parentage would plague genealogists for centuries. Still, DNA analysis has revealed startling possibilities that illuminate the complex nature of American bloodlines in the early republic. Recent genetic studies suggest that Nancy may have carried markers consistent with both English nobility and indigenous American heritage, a combination that reflects the brutal realities of colonial contact and the hidden stories of intermarriage that official histories often obscured. If these connections are accurate, Abraham Lincoln's blood carried within it the DNA of both the conquerors and the conquered, the European settlers who claimed the continent, and the Native Americans who had called it home for millennia. This genetic complexity was further complicated by the social environment in which Thomas and Nancy Lincoln lived. Kentucky in the early 1800s was a borderland where different worlds collided. White settlers, displaced Native Americans, freed enslaved people, and indentured servants all struggled for survival in a landscape that offered both opportunity and danger. The Lincoln cabin in Hodgenville existed at the intersection of these competing populations, and the bloodline that would produce Abraham Lincoln absorbed influences from all of them. Thomas Lincoln's work as a carpenter and farmer brought him into contact with people from every level of Kentucky society, from wealthy slaveholders to poor laborers, and each interaction left its mark on the family's understanding of America's possibilities and contradictions. Nancy Hanks Lincoln's death in 1818 from milk sickness marked another crucial moment in the formation of Abraham Lincoln's genetic and psychological inheritance. Her death removed the maternal influence that might have tempered the harshness of frontier life, leaving young Abraham and his sister Sarah under the care of a father who struggled with depression, alcoholism, and the constant pressure of economic failure. The trauma of maternal loss created a psychological wound that would influence Lincoln's entire approach to relationships, politics, and leadership. But Nancy's death also meant that her genetic contribution to the Lincoln bloodline would remain frozen at the moment of her death, preserved in her children like a genetic time capsule that carried the unresolved mysteries of her own ancestry. Thomas Lincoln's remarriage to Sarah Bush Johnston brought stability to the household but also introduced new genetic influences into Abraham's environment. Sarah's children from her previous marriage carried their own ancestral heritage, creating a blended family that reflected the complex nature of frontier kinship networks. Sarah herself brought a bloodline that traced back to English and Scottish settlers, people who had survived the religious wars of the 17th century and the economic upheavals of the 18th. Her influence on young Abraham was profound. She encouraged his education, supported his intellectual curiosity, and provided the emotional stability that had been missing since his mother's death. In genetic terms, Sarah's nurturing created an environment that allowed Abraham's inherited intelligence to flourish, transforming the raw material of his ancestry into the intellectual capacity that would eventually reshape American society. The Lincoln bloodline also carried within it the genetic legacy of physical and mental health challenges that would influence every aspect of Abraham's life and career. The family suffered from what modern medical analysis suggests was a genetic predisposition to depression, a condition that manifested differently in each generation but never disappeared entirely. Thomas Lincoln's struggles with mood and motivation reflected this genetic burden, as did the melancholy that would become Abraham's most distinctive personal characteristic. But the same genetic factors that predispose the family to depression also seem to enhance a specific cognitive abilities, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and the capacity for deep empathy that would make Abraham Lincoln one of America's most effective political leaders. The physical characteristics that made Lincoln instantly recognizable, his towering height, elongated limbs, and distinctive facial features, also reflected the complex genetic inheritance that shaped his bloodline. Modern medical analysis suggests that Lincoln may have carried genetic markers associated with Marfan syndrome. This connective tissue disorder affects skeletal development and can cause a distinctive physical appearance, making Lincoln seem like a figure from folklore rather than flesh and blood. This genetic condition, if present, would have been inherited from his ancestral line and would help explain not only Lincoln's unusual appearance, but also the health challenges that plagued him throughout his adult life. But Lincoln's genetic inheritance extended far beyond physical characteristics and health predispositions. It included the accumulated cultural knowledge and social adaptations that his ancestors had developed over 2 centuries of American experience. The English Puritans, who formed the foundation of his bloodline, had created a culture that valued education, hard work, and moral righteousness, even in the face of hardship and persecution. The Welsh elements in his ancestry contributed a stubborn independence and resistance to authority that would prove crucial in Lincoln's political career. The frontier experience that shaped his immediate family had taught the survival skills and practical wisdom necessary for success in a democratic society that rewarded merit over birth. Abraham Lincoln's own contributions to the family bloodline began with his marriage to Mary Todd in 1842, a union that brought together 2 distinctly different American genealogical traditions. Mary's ancestry traced back to Scottish nobility and Kentucky's planter elite, families who had achieved wealth and social status through land speculation, slavery, and political connections. Her bloodline carried the DNA of European aristocracy. Still, it had been shaped by the American experience of westward expansion and the opportunities available to ambitious families in a rapidly developing nation. The Todd family's success in Kentucky society demonstrated the possibilities available to those who could navigate the complex social and economic networks of the early republic. The marriage between Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd represented more than just a personal union. It was a genetic merger that brought together 2 fundamentally different approaches to American life. Lincoln's bloodline carried the heritage of religious dissenters, frontier survivors, and working-class immigrants who had achieved success through individual effort and moral conviction. Mary's ancestry reflected the experience of families who had used wealth, social connections, and political influence to establish themselves among America's emerging elite. Their children, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, inherited genetic material from both traditions, creating a new generation that carried within their blood the full spectrum of American social experience. The Lincoln children's genetic inheritance would prove both a blessing and a curse. Robert Lincoln inherited his father's intellectual capacity and his mother's social connections, allowing him to build a successful career in law and business, while also serving as a bridge between his father's legacy and the Gilded Age elite. But Edward Lincoln died in 1850 at age 3, possibly from tuberculosis, a disease that reflected the health challenges that haunted both sides of the family tree. William Lincoln died in 1862 at age 11, likely from typhoid fever contracted in the White House, his death casting a shadow over the presidency that would never fully lift. Thomas "Tad" Lincoln survived to adulthood but struggled with learning disabilities and speech problems that may have reflected genetic factors inherited from both parents. The genetic legacy that Abraham Lincoln passed to his descendants also included the psychological burdens that came with bearing one of America's most famous names. The Lincoln bloodline after 1865 would be forever marked by the martyrdom of the president, creating expectations and pressures that few families could successfully navigate. Robert Lincoln lived his entire adult life in the shadow of his father's assassination, struggling to build his own identity while serving as the keeper of the Lincoln legacy. His marriage to Mary Mamie Harlan brought new genetic influences into the family line, Still, it also created new tensions, as the Harlan family's political connections and social aspirations sometimes conflicted with the more modest origins of the Lincoln heritage. The expansion of the Lincoln bloodline through Robert's children, Mary, Abraham II, and Jesse, represented the family's integration into America's industrial elite. Still, it also marked the gradual dilution of the genetic and cultural influences that had shaped the original Lincoln character. Mary Mamie Lincoln Isham inherited her grandfather's name and some of his intellectual capacity, but her life as a member of Chicago society bore little resemblance to the frontier experience that had forged the presidential Lincoln's character of the presidential Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln II died in London in 1890 at age 16, his death marking the end of the direct male line that had carried the Lincoln name from English Puritanism to American greatness. Jesse Harlan Lincoln's marriage to Warren Wallace Beckwith created the final chapter in the Lincoln genealogical story, as their children, Mary Peggy Beckwith and Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, represented the last generation to carry a direct genetic connection to the 16th president. Their lives spanned the transformation of America from a rural republic to a global superpower, but the genetic influences that had shaped Abraham Lincoln's character became increasingly diluted with each generation. By the time Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith died in 1985, the Lincoln bloodline had been absorbed into the broader American population. Its distinctive characteristics dissolved into the great genetic mixing bowl that defines the modern United States. Yet the influence of Abraham Lincoln's genetic heritage extends far beyond his direct descendants. The political and social changes that he initiated created ripple effects that continue to shape American society more than 150 years after his death. The emancipation of 4 million enslaved people fundamentally altered the genetic composition of American culture. As formerly enslaved people and their descendants gained the freedom to form families, pursue education, and contribute their own ancestral heritage to the American bloodline. The preservation of the Union ensured that the diverse genetic influences from every region of the country would continue to interact and blend, creating the complex, multicultural society that defines modern America. The Lincoln bloodline also carries within it the unresolved tensions that continue to define American society. The same genetic and cultural influences that enabled Lincoln to navigate the contradictions of 19th century America. The tension between individual freedom and social order, between economic opportunity and moral responsibility, between local autonomy and national unity, continue to challenge his genetic and spiritual descendants. The racism that Lincoln inherited from his frontier upbringing was never fully resolved, just as the economic inequalities that shaped his early life continue to plague American society. The depression and melancholy that marked his personal character reflect psychological burdens that echo through generations of Americans who struggle to reconcile the promises of a democratic society with the realities of persistent inequality and injustice. Modern DNA analysis has revealed additional complexities in the Lincoln genealogical story that illuminate the hidden histories of American racial mixing and social mobility. Genetic markers found in Lincoln family descendants suggest possible connections to populations that official genealogies have overlooked or deliberately obscured. Some studies indicate the presence of genetic material consistent with both sub-Saharan African and Native American ancestry, reflecting the complex realities of frontier life, where official racial boundaries were often more fluid than legal and social structures suggested. These findings do not diminish Lincoln's historical significance. If anything, they enhance our understanding of how American bloodlines have always been more diverse and interconnected than traditional narratives acknowledge. The international dimensions of the Lincoln bloodline also reveal connections that extend far beyond American borders. Genealogical research has traced Lincoln family connections to Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, reflecting the complex patterns of migration and intermarriage that connected the British Isles to the American frontier. Some studies suggest possible connections to French Huguenot refugees, and German religious dissenters, populations that fled religious persecution in Europe and found refuge in the American colonies. These international connections remind us that American bloodlines have always been global phenomena, shaped by the movement of people, ideas, and genetic material across continents and oceans. The scientific analysis of Lincoln's genetic heritage has also provided insights into the relationship between genetics and historical achievement. Studies of Lincoln's family DNA have identified genetic markers associated with high intelligence, pattern recognition, and emotional sensitivity, characteristics that help explain Lincoln's extraordinary political skills and his capacity for empathy that enabled him to navigate the moral complexities of slavery and civil war. But the same genetic factors that contributed to his greatness also created vulnerabilities that haunted his personal life and may have shortened his career even if John Wilkes Booth's bullet had never found its mark. Abraham Lincoln's death at Ford's Theater represented more than just the assassination of a president. It marked the violent interruption of a genetic experiment that had been unfolding for over 2 centuries. The bloodline that had carried English Puritanism to American soil, that had survived Indian wars and frontier hardships, that had absorbed influences from Welsh mountains and Virginia plantations, reached its historical culmination in the man who preserved the Union and freed the enslaved people. But Lincoln's assassination meant that his genetic contribution to American society was cut short at the moment of his greatest triumph, leaving future generations to wonder what additional contributions his bloodline might have made to American society if he had lived to serve a full second term and beyond. The legacy of Abraham Lincoln's bloodline extends beyond genetics to encompass the cultural and political inheritance that continues to shape American society. The democratic ideals that Lincoln articulated during the Civil War, the belief that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth, represent more than just political philosophy. They reflect the accumulated wisdom of generations of Americans who struggled to build a society based on individual freedom and collective responsibility. Lincoln's genetic ancestors contributed their own understanding of these challenges, from the English Puritans who sought religious liberty to the frontier settlers who created new forms of community organization in the wilderness. Today, millions of Americans carry genetic material that connects them to the populations that shaped Lincoln's ancestry. English Puritans, Welsh resistance fighters, Irish refugees, German religious dissenters, and the enslaved Africans whose liberation became Lincoln's most outstanding achievement. The Lincoln bloodline serves as a reminder that American identity has always been a complex mixture of different genetic, cultural, and historical influences. The man who saved the Union and freed the enslaved people was himself the product of this mixing, his character shaped by the accumulated experiences of ancestors who had survived religious persecution, economic hardship, and the constant challenges of life in a developing democratic society. The study of Abraham Lincoln's genealogy also reveals the extent to which American history has been shaped by genetic, chance, and historical accident. If Samuel Lincoln had chosen to remain in England rather than migrate to Massachusetts, if a Shawnee warrior had not killed the elder Abraham Lincoln, if Thomas Lincoln had not married Nancy Hanks, if any of 1,000 small decisions had been made differently, the genetic combination that produced Abraham Lincoln would never have existed. The 16th president's bloodline represents a unique convergence of genetic influences that could only have occurred in the specific historical circumstances of early American development. Yet Lincoln's assassination also ensured that his genetic legacy would be preserved in American memory as a kind of sacred inheritance. The martyred president became a symbol of American possibility, proof that a democratic society could produce leaders capable of moral greatness and political wisdom. His bloodline became part of American mythology, a reminder that the humblest origins could make the most significant achievements. The log cabin where he was born and the theater where he died became shrines to the democratic faith that ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, could achieve extraordinary things. As we trace the final moments of Abraham Lincoln's life, the bullet entering his brain at 10:15 p.m. on April 14, 1865, the slow journey across the street to the Peterson house, the long night of waiting as doctors tried desperately to save the president's life, and finally the moment at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, when Lincoln drew his last breath, we witnessed not just the death of a man, but the end of a genealogical experiment that had taken over 2 centuries to unfold. The bloodline that had carried so much history, that had absorbed so many influences, and produced such remarkable character and achievement, was reduced in an instant to memory and legacy. But perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of Abraham Lincoln's genealogy, that individual bloodlines, no matter how remarkable their origins or achievements, are always temporary phenomena in the larger sweep of human history. What matters is not the preservation of specific genetic combinations, but the continuation of the values and ideals that those bloodlines helped to create and preserve. Lincoln's true inheritance to America was not his DNA, but his demonstration that a democratic society could produce leaders capable of moral courage and political wisdom. His bloodline reminds us that American greatness has always emerged from the mixing of different populations, the blending of diverse influences, and the constant struggle to build a society worthy of its highest aspirations. In the end, Abraham Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater marked both an ending and a beginning, the death of a remarkable individual's bloodline and the birth of a national legacy that continues to inspire Americans and people around the world. The genetic experiment that produced the great emancipator ended with John Wilkes Booth's bullet. Still, the political and moral experiment that Lincoln represented continues in every generation of Americans who choose to honor the better angels of their nature and work toward the more perfect union that remains democracy's most significant promise.